I think it's time we get started. It's 8:30 my time. I'm in Calgary, Alberta. Good morning, afternoon, evening to wherever you are around the globe. My name is Dr. Glen Kitteringham, and I'm this week's guest moderator. This is our 51st Thought Leadership webinar that they've been running since late March, beginning of the pandemic, as we're all aware. And they've been running every Tuesday and Thursday consistently since then. Today's Thought Leadership webinar, are private military companies part of the private security sector, and why are they different, or are they? And just want to recognize that the perpetuity research is supported, a number of organizations across the bottom. So we just wanted to thank our supporters. So just to give you a little bit of an overview, we're just going to introduce each of the panelists, or the panelists will introduce themselves. They will each have a 3-minute opening statement, and then we will be open to questions asked by attendees. And so we look forward to getting your questions in. I just want to remind you to please submit your questions through the Q&A and not through the chat. And without further ado, I'd like to start off with Dr. Declan Garrett.
Hi, Glenn. Thank you. My name is Dr. Declan Garrett. I'm the Director of Security Institute of Ireland and the Chair of Academic Governors.
Oana.
Hi, I'm Oana Miharake, and I'm a consultant for Soprasteria Next in Paris, France.
Thank you. Maria.
Hello, I'm Maria Nebolsina, a researcher for Center for Euro-Atlantic Security in GMO University in Moscow, Russia.
Thank you. And Adam White.
Hi there, my name's Adam White. I'm a senior lecturer in criminology at the University of Sheffield in the UK.
Welcome everybody, and for your 3-minute introduction, opening statement, again, Dr. Garrett.
Thank you, Glenn. I've tried to frame this opening statement around the general theme, but I think the main question is, are private military companies and private security industry, are they the same or are they different? For me, I think one of the main issues that we're facing is that we have a bit of a definitional dilemma. And in addition to that, we also have we have a lack of a lot of research in this particular area. So in answering the question, it's a great question, but a very difficult one to answer due to I suppose, the lack of information that exists. And when we look at the mainstream security, private security sector, I think most of us would say that private military contractors don't really sit or fit with the day-to-day security guard that we meet, whether that be the security guard you meet in the shopping mall or the hotel, or it's the bouncer you meet at night time. I don't feel that we would include private military contractors. I think our perception, and probably the world's perception of private military contractors, is probably stemmed from, I suppose, the press to a certain degree, but also most likely from movies, and you know, we hear terms such as mercenaries and soldiers of fortune, etc. And these are not really terms that we associate with a regulated private security sector. And I think that is one of the fundamental things as well. The private security sector in most parts of the world is regulated, and you know, from probably the mid-90s up to into the noughties, it was something that started to begin and has moved on, and it's controlled, and we know what we're dealing with, we know who the people are, and we know what they do. For the private military companies, it's much of a very gray area. We really don't know what they do, but I think one of the main things that we do know what they do is they work in high-risk environments. And one of the other areas that I see is that, interestingly, we use similar terminology, which I think forms part of the confusion, in that sense that there's a UN report there from the mid-noughties that refers to private military companies from a definition perspective as security guards. And there lies one of the issues. In addition to that, we have them doing bodyguard work in various different areas. We have them doing traditional sentry type duties. This is what's reported in, I suppose, high-risk environments, war-torn areas, similar though to what security guards do in the mainstream security sector. So for me, are they the same? They're absolutely not. But at the same time, there's a lot of confusion and there's a lot of issues around defining what they are and who they are. And very, very limited research, apart from the likes of the UN, etc., that have done some work on it. But I don't think it's been a great source of information. And I think it's a closed world. That's one of the other issues I think that we face as well. They don't really like to let academics in. They don't like to leave the world into what they do. So I have some other thoughts and ideas on as well, which we can talk throughout the session, but I'm conscious of the 3 minutes. So, okay. Thanks, Glen.
Thank you, Declan. Oana.
Yeah, thank you. So over a long time, the private military company sector was created actually and dominated by the US and the West more general. However, more recently, two countries have shown their interest in this field, namely Russia and China. Russian private military company Wagner has triggered attention recently with the conflict in Ukraine, Syria, and it's actually operating today in more than 20 African states. It's actually part of Russian national interest without actually showing it's actively participating to a crisis. So furthermore, actually private military companies are changing the international governance and the way we think about warfare. They are increasing the use of hybrid warfare techniques, and it's also by actually using soft power such as social media by influencing public opinion. And for China, China is actually exploring private military companies directly on the ground by transforming its private security companies into private military companies in Africa. So the debate today will tackle on the definition of the definition and the difference between private military companies and private security companies. I would say that in the past, they could be differentiated by three main typologies. A company that offers offensive capabilities, a company that offers consulting services, and another one that offers logistic military support. However, in reality, we can see that actually those companies offer them all. They have a broad spectrum of services and they try to integrate all of them into their offer. So when it comes to the adequate control of private military companies, I have identified several challenges in order to ensure a good use of private military companies. The first one would be the sovereignty dilemma, so who is in charge of giving orders to these companies? The second one would be the responsibility, so who is responsible for their crimes and their actions? The third one would be ethics, because first and foremost, a private military company is a private company, so it's looking to actually gain commercial profit rather than to solve a problem. The public opinion, which actually does not really understand the way private military corporations work, and the power projection and of nations, which is the case today, as I said before, of Russia and China, which are both exploring in Africa how they can increase their capabilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Oana. Thank you very much. Maria.
Yes, well, the problem of distinguishing between PMCs and PSCs is nagging, and there are lots of definitions of both kinds of services. The UN Draft Convention unites PMCs and PSCs in one definition, but it separates private security services from private military services. The Montreux document also unites PMCs and PSCs, but unlike the UN, it doesn't separate private security services from private military services. Some experts like Moshe Schwartz, in his report to Congress, divide services provided by PSCs into two major categories, armed services and unarmed services. But to make a long story short, there is a bulk of definitions and approaches to what PMCs and PSCs are. And I would like to make three statements. First is that there is one thing in common that unites PMCs and PSCs. Generally speaking, both are mostly active in conflict or war zones. They're also active in peacekeeping, though the UN doesn't engage companies for military activities. Still, it seems not easy to distinguish security services from military ones. if they are fulfilled by one and the same company in different areas of conflicts and different circumstances and environment. How do we attribute J-force activities if it combines both military and security? Or how to define Israeli left-done that trained Congolese government troops in Brazzaville during armed conflict in DRC in the 90s? Does the environment matter if it influences the definition? Can the same services be military in one situation and security in other situation? Second is that this is the reason for conflating PMSCs with mercenarism. I think that conflict and military dangerous environment unites these groups of activities, and it becomes more clear when we read the UN statements, UN documents, resolutions, and so on. Even the UN often puts the equal mark between the two definitions. What is more about that is that the mandate of the UN working group that worked on the draft convention on PMSCs was named the working group on the use of mercenaries as a means of violating human rights and so on. And third is that military and security activities seem to be different. As we can see in some countries where private military activity, in one country, private military activity is prohibited, in another country, private military activity is allowed, some countries allow only private security activities, and so on. Thus, every country seems to understand the difference between the two. But when it comes to international control, I think that's political interest clash. And here we can say one man's volunteer is another man's mercenary. When British pilots are trained by private instructors, this is one thing. When American private instructors train Georgian national forces, this is another thing. And when, let me say, presumably Russian hoodlums provide Haftar forces with certain support, this is third thing. So these are the three statements I would love to make.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you very much. Adam.
Thank you. Well, my position in this difference similarity debate is slightly messy, and I can see it from both directions. So I want to start off with difference, which involves kind of caricaturing private military and private security. So on the private military side, you might have companies that are operating in war zones or countries transitioning out of war, let's say Iraq, Afghanistan, post 9/11. These companies are designed to work for or alongside the military and may well be on military contracts from the US Department of Defense. They may be run by ex-soldiers and employ ex-soldiers. Why? Because they carry weapons and where necessary may well engage in lethal force. And this is their main value in the market. And in terms of the variety of regulations that surround their activities, one of them is international humanitarian law, so the laws of war. So that would be one caricature for private military. Then you look at private security. These would be companies operating in peacetime against the backdrop of law and order, perhaps in the UK. These are companies designed to work for and alongside civilians. They'll be run by people from a range of backgrounds. And they'll engage in a more civilian-like model of social control or policing, and that's their main business. And amongst the regulations that govern their behaviour, you'll find lots of civilian norms that are often executed through national statutory regulation. So there you've got two caricatures of a private military and a private security that have analytical purchase and that speak to the idea of difference. But at the same time, you can challenge a lot of those kind of caricatures, and in so doing, bring out or tease out some similarities. So just to throw a few into the mix, you get companies that are operating in hostile environments in Iraq, Afghanistan, but engaging in operations, asset protection, that looks quite similar to the type of operations you'd see, let's say, in the UK. Also companies in Iraq and Afghanistan that will be working on civilian contracts, perhaps for an oil company. You've also got the issue that in recent years, through acquisitions and mergers, you've got private security companies and private military companies becoming part of one another. Let's say G4S buying out Armour Group, or Gardewell buying up Aegis. And then they package that whole corporate enterprise as private security, which again kind of blurs that private military, private security divide. The labour market itself is quite fluid. You may have individuals who are working on contracts in Iraq, Afghanistan, but then in the UK and the US and in the Middle East. And so you lose the private security, private military distinction there. And then lastly, just to shake up the geography a little bit more, you consider countries in Latin America that may be at peace, not at war. There is a backdrop of law and order, but they're far more violent. You might find private security officers who are armed and engaged in the application of lethal force, but against the backdrop of what you might consider to be private security. So again, that sort of challenges that the private military, private security distinction and throws into ideas of similarity.
Excellent. Thank you, Adam. Thank you all for your opening statements, all fascinating. We've got several questions that have come in. We had one come in earlier today. And the question is, what role can French and Portuguese public and private sector organizations, including major companies, play in liaising with UK and US counterparts in raising awareness of Russian and Chinese PMCs and PSCs in developing countries? And if you need me to repeat that question, I will. I know it's a complex one, but can I open that up, or who would like to tackle that one?
Could you maybe just repeat it once again?
Sure. Okay. And it's very specific. I realize that. So, what role can French and Portuguese public and private sector organizations, including major companies, play in liaising with UK and US counterparts in raising awareness of Russian and Chinese PMCs and PSCs in developing countries? I think what the question really is, and I'm gonna simplify this, is what should public and private sector organizations be doing in reaching out to the US and the UK in reference to Chinese and Russian private military companies operating in developing nations? Is anybody feel comfortable in answering that question?
Well, I can try. Actually, I don't think it's about separating some countries to and other countries. I think it's more about getting a broad definition into the international of the international community, and also having international regulations on the topic, because we cannot go and say oh Russia, China, you cannot do those things in Africa, let's say. Like, all the rules have to apply to everyone, and I think it's a topic that needs to be debated at a high level institution such as the UN.
Okay. So on that note, the question I have next is, and I'll throw this open to everybody. Do you think there should be a clear distinction between private military companies and private security companies? Should they be completely separate?
Go on, Declan.
No, go ahead, Adam. Go on.
Adam?
In my view, yes, we need the terminology so we can debate it, but I don't think you'll arrive at a nice, neat answer. I think all of our introductory statements highlighted the fact that we can see virtue in talking about private security and private military. They both clearly raise certain characteristics, but there is no neat sector. I think if you were to go back 25 years to sort of the mid to late 90s, then perhaps at that time you could see private security companies operating in domestic environments. You know, you've got your G4S, Securitas, Mighty, and so on. And you could see your private military companies like Sandline and Executive Outcomes working in Sierra Leone and engaging in very much military-like operations. But I think in the period since then, for me anyway, there's been so much kind of restructuring in the market. There's been so much more outsourcing from the public to the private sector that any neat distinctions blur, you know, just get lost in the blur. But we need to debate them, and to debate them, we need the two terms.
Right. Okay. Declan, anything to add?
Yeah.
Very.
Sorry.
Oh.
Yeah.
Similar to what Adam was saying, Glenn, I think a lot has happened since we first introduced, I suppose, definitions and regulations of the private security sector back in the 90s and the noughties. But one of the things I think is important to separate them around is around the definition, because the definition of what they do links to a lot of other things, such as what level of training they have, what level of training they should have, how they're overseen, etc. And I think unless we have a clear definition or a clear distinction between them, it does blur a lot of things. And I also see an issue around, I suppose, a certain aspect around professionalization. And we've been through this professionalization discussion concept with the private security sector for a number of years. And if you go back a number of years again, and you look at, I equate a certain amount of the perception around the bouncer risk type view of the world that we have. I don't think the private military contractors, based on the perception we have, is necessarily a good perception to be associated with the private security sector, because they do seem to be able to, or they do seem to operate in a completely different world and do completely different things. I just don't think it's healthy to keep the two of them together. And taking what Adam was saying and the other speakers, they do need to be debated, and it do needs to be clearly defined what they are and who they are, because at the moment there's too many blurred lines there.
Right. Maria, you wanted to say something.
Yes, this is quite a confusing question, because if every country has its legislation on private security or private military companies, then everybody in these countries, at least, they understand what they mean, and they can divide one from another. But international documents, the Draft UN Convention, Montreal document, they combine both. So they don't distinct one from another, and maybe that's why the UN Draft Convention doesn't work, because it is legally a legal document, legally obliged, and it's hard for states to stick to this, to the new convention, let's say. That's why Montreux is more preferable, because it's not legally obliged, or it's more easy to follow, let's say. Though it combines private military and private security companies in one definition. For me, it's also a question, and I'm trying just to debate, to figure out for me, what is that? Is it okay that we have internationally or in international documents? If it is not, shall we divide security from military, private security from private military, and so on? This is a question for me as well.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oana, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one point. Actually, if you start differentiating the two, what happens with the companies, with major companies that we see today, that are both offering security and military services? How do you define them? And it's actually, it's creating a bigger problem, because you have those offering military services, those offering security services, and those offering them all.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you've really hit the nail on the head there. There are some companies who are doing both. So we've got lots of questions flooding in. I wish, to be perfectly honest, I wish we had a lot more time, but I'm very cognizant of it. So we have a question, and I apologize if I got your name wrong, but I'm going to give it a stab. It's Leighton Kangaz. And the question is how about private security, defining the difference is private security provides private law enforcement services, and military companies provide private military services to governments. Could it be that simple?
Maybe, Glenn, if I could answer that. I think Adam already answered that question in a different way, and when he said that the private security sector, civilians providing a service with a civilian backdrop, and that's the reality of it. The private military companies are civilians, but they're not providing it necessarily against a civilian backdrop. They're providing it against, I suppose, a military or a kind of a high risk environment. So that's my view on it.
Right. Okay. Any of the other panelists? Anything to add?
One small thing, which is I get lost in that exact question. And the way I've started to think about it personally is private policing and private soldiering, because they instantly lend themselves to very different functions and environments and professions. And I like, you know, in that way you can start to see private security as perhaps being the equivalent to the private police, and private military as being the equivalent to private soldiering. Policing and soldiering for me are clearer terms, but I think we've become so used to this private security, private military language that we're debating it in those terms. I'm not sure they're the best terms ultimately, I suppose.
Right.
However, when they both have weapons, it's really difficult to differentiate both of them, because they don't wear uniforms, they're civilians, but they do have weapons. So it's also really difficult on the ground to differentiate them, because you don't know who they're actually protecting. Are they operating for military forces? Are they operating for law enforcement? Or are they protecting humanitarian workers? Is really difficult to differentiate them just based on this simple opposition between both.
Right. So I guess the question, my follow-up question on all this is it simply that they're necessary and they are providing a necessary service, and we're blowing this whole thing out of proportion? I'm throwing that out to the whole panel.
I think
let me divide that into two questions. First of all, are they necessary?
I think they're necessary, Glen, in some environments, particularly around peacekeeping missions. They also do a lot of good work in terms of training as well and consulting in these types of environments. So they have a really good place in those areas. I think where the areas that we probably have concern about is probably the grey areas that they operate within, or that they're perceived to operate within. But certainly within peacekeeping and training, and you know, if you also look at Hurricane Katrina, you know, these types of military companies were used in that environment, and they have a really strong place for that. It's when their powers are used for the wrong reasons, or it's when they do things for the wrong reasons, or there's limited oversight and they're able to do what they want to do. I think that's where the problems are with this.
Right. Maria, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think that, yes, this is the reality. PMSCs, PSCs, PMCs, this is the reality. And COVID-19 proved that PMSCs are very flexible companies. They just, you know, they protected people, they helped with hospitals, with queuing, social distancing, and so on and so forth. So this is the true force that can be used in any environment, in peace environment, in war environment, in conflicts, in peacekeeping, and so on. So this is a tool, a very useful one, and I think that the society needs it. But for the rest of the world, for people to be, you know, to feel okay with these companies, yes, there should be a kind of control, maybe parliament control, or the UN control, or any kind of monitoring of this sphere, so that everybody would feel okay that such companies with weapons do a good job, let's say, like this.
Right, and you're talking about accountability. We've got a question from a former panelist, Michael Gips, and his question is, isn't the basic distinction between security companies and private military companies is that military companies operate as offensive forces, conducting operations, etc., while security companies are deployed for defensive, deterrent, and responsive purposes?
There's an interesting backdrop to that question, which is, I know Maria sort of touched on this earlier, but Article 47 of the first additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions in 1977 was the first kind of real attempt to define mercenaries in international law, and it had the word direct participation in activities. Okay, and this issue of direct participation became a real kind of issue on which lots turned. So private military companies were often seen to be private military because they partook in direct operations and therefore became kind of tagged as mercenary organizations. But if you were to not take direct part in hostilities, maybe indirect, maybe through support mechanisms or defensive, then you became private security. But of course, all private military companies worth their salt, especially in the post 9/11 era, have been extremely careful to avoid any allegations of direct participation because they want to steer clear of the definitions of mercenaries in international law. So they will put themselves across as defensive, but who will engage when in lethal force if they come under attack, at which point, you know, where does offense and defense merge and blur? And in a war environment, a hostile environment, defense and offense is often very blurry. So that's been that issue of direct involvement or offense and defense has been a massive backdrop to this whole debate.
Okay. Yeah, no, absolutely. Great points. Oana, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's also the Geneva Convention does not recognize actually so it does not recognize the mercenaries, and it does not recognize the right for those private military companies to have the right to see their prisoners. So prisoners will not be treated as a war prisoner if they are taken into guard. That's why actually companies do not want to be seen as operating on the ground. But if I come back to the differentiation between security and military, the thing is that a military company can also be just giving consulting services on strategy on the ground. Does that mean it's a security company because it's not actively offering offensive capabilities, or it could be considered military because it's actually giving support to a state on strategy and on how to operate on the ground? So I think it's more than just differentiating the offensive and non-offensive capabilities, because there are many things that could go through the military that are actually non-offensive.
Yeah, and Oana, you touch on a very interesting point. I mean, basically military advisors. And as we all know, historically, companies have been providing military advisors probably for as long as there's been military. And that's one way that people, that they get around the rules, so to speak. So, so we have more questions, and we've got about 12 minutes left, 10 minutes left. Another question, and this is for all panelists. This is from you and Grant from London. For all panelists, based on Dr. Garrett's opening remarks about a lack of awareness, any thoughts on how comfortable UN civilian contractors and career UN staff are in contacting groups who may be best described as PMCs? Has anybody had any interaction with UN staff and and I know you'd be speaking on behalf of them, but any insights by anybody about how the UN may feel about dealing with PMCs?
No contacts. I don't have contacts with them. I would love to have, but yeah.
Okay, all right. So here's a question from Jamie Williamson. So is more transparency, accountability needed in the private military contractor sector or in the private security industry?
I think maybe, I think one of the worries, I think regulation of the private security sector has not been without its flaws, and I think we all would agree with that. But in the main, it has been good for the private security sector because it has dealt with some of the irregularities that were in it, and it has, to a certain degree, assisted in professionalizing it. One of the concerns I have with the regulation of private military contractors is regulation has a couple of different strands for it. So regulation will deal with the bad, and it will stop bad people becoming involved in a service that's there to protect the public interest. But it will also protect the employees that work for these companies. And this is one area that I have a little bit of a concern about, is where is the protection for these private military contractors' employees? And we know that there's been quite a few that have been killed while at work. Now, we don't necessarily think that's the right thing to do, is to send people out to work every day and not come back. It doesn't work like that. They're civilian people working for an organization, and they're bound by the same, employment laws and safety laws that we're all bound by. But where my real worry is the people that are coming into this industry. Not everybody is necessarily a former soldier. There is some people coming into this sector that are civilians, that are not former soldiers, that are, and I don't mean this in a disrespectful way, gullible young guys that are looking for a romantic, notion of a job that they saw somewhere on television, and they get employed. They're not suitable for that type of role, and they're not suitable for going for them high risk environments, because they're not able to they don't have the experience to deal with the things that they're going to deal with. And I wonder about the support structures that are available to them if something happens to them and afterwards. So I think the question about whether to regulate private security sector, that's already done in most regions and is kind of tried and tested. Whether we agree with it or not is a different day story. There's lots to be done there. But where I see the real issue here is the protecting the people that work within it.
Okay.
And
Thank you.
if I just may add one thing, is that actually nowadays private security companies and military companies, they respond to corporate law, which is completely different to the field they're actually operating in. So yeah, we do need good regulations, but we also need to reflect on where to put where to put those companies. Are they private? They are private, and they do have to. The company works under corporate law, but their activity does not. So there's actually all this thing that about, yes, protecting their employees, because you can protect them from the point of view of corporate law, because you do respond to that kind of law. But what happens on the ground, what happens, how like the whole thing about how the employee is treated on the ground has not been regulated at all.
Right. Okay.
Go
ahead.
There's a big issue here when you're looking at state regulation, which is, when states regulate, they set out some rules and then they monitor for compliance. So when you're doing that in a domestic environment, like in the UK, you have an inspectorate that goes out and inspects premises to check that security officers are licensed and in compliance with the law. But if you've got private military companies that are operating in hostile environments, especially kinetic ones, how do you get the inspectors out there, and how do you overcome jurisdictional issues, and which country is it that's actually seeking to regulate? Is it the country where the company is headquartered, or the country where the company is operating? I mean, there's so many issues in bringing about effective regulation in anything approaching a war zone when you compare it to sort of a domestic civil society situation. So my point, I suppose, is that I don't think it's possible to achieve the same levels of transparency in each.
Can I add something? That's what Adam said. I totally agree with that. How to compare, let's say, the situation with PMSCs and PSCs in Russia and in the United States. The transparency level is absolutely different. And that's what Garrett says, that we need to protect our contractors and so on. Yes, he's absolutely right, but Russia doesn't think about its contractors at all. Who is going to protect? What kind of laws? What kind of enforcement? Whom are we talking about? The body who is going to protect, to survey, to monitor, and so on. Is it going to be domestic domestic body, or is it going to be international body to control to keep them safe and so on. Who is going to do this?
So, and that's an excellent question, Maria, and which leads me back to answer the question, or to ask the question of all of you, which is, obviously this is a global issue. The UN is there. We all know they've created a couple of documents, but how, from everybody's perspective, how high on the priority list is it right now, let's say, for the UN to take further steps in controlling PMCs? Anybody have any thoughts or knowledge on where things sit right now?
Well, if you don't mind, the UN had 3 working groups on this topic. One worked out the draft convention, another came into force afterwards, when the convention was under survey in ministries of foreign affairs in different countries. And another open-ended group with a very long name came in 2017, if I'm not mistaken. And they went back to the very beginning. They tried to negotiate definitions. They tried to negotiate what kind of services any country can allow to be to outsource or not to be outsourced, and so on. The UN tries, I think that it moves more to the Montreux document, the Montreux pattern, because any convention, it's very general. It cannot be, it can be imposed, of course. Like we have a convention on mercenary, on mercenarism. Does it work? How to catch this mercenary by the hand, according to all these definitions, 5 or 6 definitions of mercenary. How to catch him? And another question, does the society or do governments want to catch mercenaries? Maybe that's why the meaning one and the same. The definition is still here since 1947. It's one and the same in the Convention on Mercenarism. I mean, from Protocol 1 of Geneva Conventions since 1947 till present 1989, the Convention on Mercenary. The definition is one and the same. So, do we want to make mercenaries accountable? I mean, the government. Do they want to make mercenaries accountable? Does convention work? Not really, I think. So, to my mind, the convention on PMSCs, if it ever comes into force, I think it will be more flexible, so that it will be okay for the countries that sign it, at least.
Okay. All right. Excellent question, Maria. Excellent response. We need to wrap this up. If I could just have each of you just give your final closing statement of just about 20 seconds, please. Declan.
Thanks, Glen. I think, I suppose, my closing statement perspective, I think there's a real place for PMCs if it's not, if it's accountable. I think that's where my issue with it is. And that everything is done for the right reasons, the peacekeeping side of things, etc. In terms of the original question, are they different for the private security sector? I still think yes. They don't sit with the mainstream private security sector as we know it, and they're going to be a very difficult group to regulate if you're going to regulate. If you take the Montreux document that's been mentioned, it's a good practice document. It's a good practice document, but who's going to monitor it? You know, so.
Okay, thank you, Oana.
Yeah, so as we've seen in this debate, actually, so the private military sector has actually shifted the way we think about warfare and we think about security. And yes, there is a need for a clear definition and for organizations and states to take action, to regulate, but also to ensure public debate, to ensure ethical to ensure that private military companies and security companies will work in an ethical way, and also to actually do good and not just use them to cover their actions.
Okay, thank you, Oana. Maria.
Well, yes, thanks a lot for invitation and for taking part, for listening to you. What I think about all this is that I think that one thing will be good for everybody if we're talking about the UN Convention and any general document, if we admit that mass destructive weapon cannot be outsourced. I think that all the countries will say yes. At least we have one point to start with, and then maybe we can move forward to understand what is military, what is security, and so on. What kind of functions can be outsourced or cannot be outsourced.
All right, thank you. Adam.
Thanks. Closing comment, I think nation states have quite a clear distinction between police forces and militaries. And I think a lot of what we've been discussing today is an attempt to almost categorize the market into equivalents of police and militaries. But markets don't work like states. Markets blur boundaries, especially state-centric ones. And I don't think it's ever going to be possible to fit the market into these state-centric categories. So it's a good debate to have, but I don't see an endpoint.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. What I got out of this fascinating conversation was that there's definitely a need for definitions. I think we all agree that we need to define what these different organizations are. Also, as Declan identified, the need for training. And Oana and Maria also talked about accountability. I think we've all talked about accountability, and those three items definitely need to be considered moving forward. So this wraps up our thought leadership webinar, and I wanted to thank everybody again for your time, panelists and attendees. Thank you all for this. Thank you for coordinators through Perpetuity Consulting. And speaking of outstanding consulting, outstanding security, just want to remind everybody that the OSPA's Outstanding Security Performance Awards are still accepting nominations, as you can see, for UK, Romania, and Germany. And the award ceremonies are coming up for the US, Kenya, and the Benelux. And just want to remind everybody that the next Thought Leadership webinar is this Thursday, September 10th. 15:30 hours British Standard Time. And again, I just want to thank absolutely everybody for this. I really appreciate all of your support. Thank you, and have a great morning, afternoon, evening. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.